Thank you for coming to this Grand Rounds event. So I'm Nick Hagemeyer. I'm an assistant professor in the Gatton College of Pharmacy. Also happen to be the director of the Community Pharmacy Practice Research Fellowship that was started in July of 2014. This is one of 4 research fellowships that are of its kind in the nation, and the only one, to my knowledge, that focuses very heavily on prescription drug abuse. So it's kind of a unique thing. We didn't know what we were going to get when we recruited for this position. We recruited for one. We got 2 outstanding fellows, one of them who's presenting today, and one of them is in the audience. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Sevak. He has quite a history. He did his pharmacy degree in India, master's in India, pharmacology PhD at Texas, right? Postdoc fellowship at University of Kentucky. Before coming to this fellowship program, he was a research faculty member at UCLA for several years, and has been in lab-based research and pursued this fellowship to transition into more naturalistic settings and practice-based research. So has a lot of expertise on prescription stimulants and illicit stimulants. So it's my pleasure to introduce you Dr. Sevak.
So thank you very much, Nick, for a very generous introduction. I appreciate it. And thank you, DIDARP and College of Public Health for organizing this Grand Round seminar series and inviting me to present among us. Very familiar faces, looks like a family gathering here. Mm-hmm. And thank you so much for taking your time to come by here and attend this seminar. Today I'm going to talk about findings from some of my studies that I conducted before joining ETSU. These studies were conducted in UCLA, University of Kentucky. And these studies primarily focused on abuse liability testing of prescription stimulant medications such as Adderall and Ritalin, its generic names diamphetamine and methylphenidate. And we examine those effects in comparison with street stimulants like methamphetamine and cocaine. You have a remote to move the slides?
Well, we do have. Ready? Thanks, Dean. Mic off.
Thank you, appreciate it. We can understand him. So the first slide is disclosure slide. I do not have any financial interest arrangements or affiliations or any kind of conflict of interest in the context of the subject of this presentation. Let me give you a little bit of background on the topic that I'm going to talk about. We all know that abuse and misuse of prescription stimulants prescription drugs as such is a major public health concern in the nation. According to this latest survey on National Southern Drug Use and Household, NSDA, it's a very well-reputed source, about 7 million Americans use and misuse, actually, non-medically use prescription drugs. Thank you so much, Randy. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
I hit the wrong button. It's my fault.
Thank you. Appreciate the help. Thank you. So a lot of Americans non-medically use prescription drugs, and as a matter of fact, number of prescription drug abusers are second only to this large problem of marijuana abusers. That tells us about an extent of this problem. And consequences are severe too. There are a number of emergency department visits and overdose deaths have been reported. And opioids, as you know, are among the widely abused prescription drugs such as oxycodone, hydrocodone, but prescription stimulants like diamphetamine and methylphenidate, the brand names are Adderall, Ritalin, Metadate, are very highly misused and abused as well. As a matter of fact, prescription stimulant abusers are twice as many as methamphetamine abusers. And these drugs have the halo of safety around them. They're FDA approved, so a lot of people have perception that these prescription stimulants carry less abuse potential than their counterparts abused on the street, like methamphetamines. But as a matter of fact, if you look at the data, the negative consequences can be very severe. And this graph shows between 2005 and 10 emergency department visits due to prescription stimulants were almost tripled in just 5 years. And then this increase in visits were by people who were age 18 and older, and half of this visits were due to non-medical use of prescription stimulants. So seeing the prevalence and consequences associated with prescription stimulants, very little research has been done to actually systematically examine the abuse potential of prescription stimulants and the variables that influence them. And like I mentioned before, the popular perception is that the street stimulants like methamphetamine and cocaine, they have very high abuse potential and prescription stimulants don't. But let's look at carefully. Let's look at them, just put it on the screen and see how they differ. This is the structure of D-amphetamine. And they have the skeleton of phenylethylamine. So this is the phenyl moiety. That's ethyl change. This 2 carbon makes a chain of ethyl, and this is a functional amine groups of phenylethylamine derivatives. How different the next drug look? Not much, right? It is only one difference is that there is a CH3 moiety, is a methyl group added, and that makes it methamphetamine. And another drug is methylphenidate. It's a pyridine ring and the same phenylethylamine skeleton. So these drugs, structurally, they don't look very different. And drugs, they look similar in terms of structure. They go into body, reach brain, and they act on similar receptor sites. The structural similarity do translate into functional similarity. Let me show you this cartoon. The receptor site that they act on are called dopamine transporters. Generally, their function is to take dopamine and other catecholamine which are in synapse back to the presynaptic terminals for storage. So the baseline dopamine tone or norepinephrine tone is maintained. Now drugs such as cocaine, methylphenidate, they bind to dopamine transporter and stop the work that it is doing. Dopamine transporter can be visualized as a vacuum cleaner. It cleans synapse and maintains the tone. Now that no longer works, and then synaptic concentration of dopamine is so much increased, it's almost flooded to an extent that it enhances postsynaptic receptor activity to a great extent and produces euphoric effects. So that's how this drug acts. And they act very similarly. They act on norepinephrine transporters, serotonin transporters, dopamine transporter, and produce this flush of monoamines in brain and produces euphoric effects. So structurally, these drugs are not different. Functionally, they produce very similar increase in monoamines in brain. With subtle differences, and these effects also translate into behavior. A lot of animal studies have shown that methamphetamine, cocaine, methylphenidate, and D-amphetamine produce very similar behavioral responses. These are animal studies done in monkeys and pigeons, and if you see the dose response curves with the slight potency changes, they almost overlap with each other. So interestingly, these 3 drugs, similar structure, function, and translating into behavior, but what's been done in humans? Not much research has been done in systematically examining those related effects of prescription stimulants and illicit stimulants in humans. In humans, we can study these drugs, and it's a paradigm called human laboratory studies. There are a range of things we can study in the human laboratory. We can systematically vary pharmacology of this drug and examine their influence on behavior. We can compare the abuse-related effects of prescription stimulants with stimulants abuse on the street. And it's a very useful platform to translate findings from animal research into humans. And a lot of other variables can be measured in the human laboratory too. We can examine cognitive performance changed by prescription stimulants. We can examine personality traits using standard instruments and psychological variables that affect the abuse-related behavior of prescription medications. And as such, human laboratory provides a very good translational venue where we can bring issues and problems we see in the real world. We find solutions in very well-controlled laboratory settings and bring them back to the real world. So it provides a very good venue. And we use this measure to conduct several studies. So today I'm going to talk about 4 different studies of mine. 3 of them are published, and first 3 are delineating the behavioral effects of D-amphetamine, methylphenidate, and methamphetamine in humans using drug discrimination and drug self-administration paradigms. And the last study examines how personality traits such as inattention and hyperactivity modulate behavioral effects of D-amphetamine. So let me begin with the first study. This study was published in Journal of Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics. As we know, methamphetamine is a major stimulant of use on the street. Added on Ritalin, they form the first line treatment in addressing narcolepsy and ADHD. They are very mainstay treatment in clinically managing these conditions. And they share structural and neurochemical effects with methamphetamine, but they're perceived to have less abuse potential. Let's see how they are really. Now, human liability provides a good platform to compare these effects, and present study use the drug discrimination paradigm to carefully assess behavioral and pharmacological effects of these stimulants. So let me talk to you about the methods. 7 participants completed this study. They range in age 20 to 24 years, were recreational stimulant users, and training dose here was 10 milligram of methamphetamine given orally. The tasting drugs and doses were a range of doses of methamphetamine, D-amphetamine, methylphenidate, and triazolone. Here you'll be surprised why I use triazolone. The triazolone is benzodiazepine. It acts on a different site than other 3 drugs act in brain. They act on GABA A receptor, so that makes it pharmacologically distinct drug. But still, it's a medication. It's not placebo. So it was. We hope that it will function as a pharmacological negative control in study, like placebo was non-pharmacological negative control in the study. Dependent measures are point distribution, subjective questionnaires, and cardiovascular measures. Point distribution was used for drug discrimination paradigm. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. Subjective drug effect questionnaires were standard, well-validated instruments that we use. Addiction Research Center inventory, it's abbreviated as ARCI, 49 true or false questions, and responses were divided into 5 different domains. This domain gave us an idea of stimulant-like prototypical effects, euphoria-producing effects, and so forth within ARCI. Another scale we used was adjective rating scale. It was 32-item questionnaire divided into 2 domains, a stimulant subscale and sedative subscale, each with 16 questions specifically asking how do you feel active, alert, and energetic, do you feel stimulated, and these subscales are very well established and they capture stimulant-like effects. This was in 92, I believe. This scale was first used in human laboratory studies in University of Arkansas. Well, a typical session looked like this. It was outpatient study in the morning. Our participants came to the lab. We did the baseline vitals and subjective measures, and at 9, drug was administered. And then every hour for the next 5 hours, they completed a lot of subjective questionnaires. And I'll show you data from those results. But before I move on, let me talk to you a little bit more about these jargons that I'm throwing at you. The drug discrimination, what is it? Let's talk more about it and how we did it. This paradigm was comprised of 3 phases: sampling, acquisition, and taste phase. In the sampling phase, there were 2 sessions. Each session lasted whole day. Like I mentioned in session timeline, in the sampling phase, we told them that you're gonna receive drug A today. By the way, it was 10 milligram methamphetamine. We didn't explicitly told them use this particular dose in this particular drug, but you're gonna receive drug A today. We have very close attention to how this drug make you feel and experience, and write your notes in a notepad that she provided you, and see how specific effects this drug producing. The reason is that we are telling you today that you're receiving drug A. After these 2 sessions, we are not going to tell you whether you receive drug A or not drug A. You're going to tell us whether you receive drug A or not drug A by performing on the point distribution task. So how they did it? So after session 3rd onwards, it was acquisition phase, and they received drug A or the not drug A. Drug A was 10 milligram methamphetamine, and not drug A was placebo. Visually similar looking capsules, but there was nothing but cornstarch in it. At the end of the day, the participants received a sealed envelope, and that told them it's the drug A or the not drug A. So it was a fun game to play with them. During the day, they distributed based on how this drug made them feel. And based on their experience on sampling session and the notes they have written, they distributed 100 points over drug A option or the non-drug A option. And indeed, if the envelope at the end of the day told that it is drug A, then the point they distributed over drug A option were reinforced with money. And if envelope said it was not drug A, the points they distributed on not drug A option were reinforced with money. So they were incentivized to pay close attention and carefully identify the received drug A or the non-drug A. And they had about 12 sessions to correctly identify whether they received 10 milligram methamphetamine or placebo. And subjects that correctly distributed 80% or more points in 4 consecutive sessions were thought to acquire discrimination, and they moved on to the test phase. So what happened in test phase? In test phase, we gave range of doses of methamphetamine, not just 10 milligram. 10 milligram was a training dose, and methylphenidate, and methamphetamine, triazolone, diamphetamine, triazolone, and placebo. During test phase, they could distribute points over either option, depending on how that particular drug made them feel, and the biggest amount of distribution on either of that option was reinforced with money. So there was no right or wrong answer in the test phase. We wanted to see that how they identify different drugs. And here are the data. And that's not the full graph, it's just a small portion. So ordinates show person drug appropriate responding practically tells how many points they distributed from 0 to 100 on drug A option. So when they did receive placebo, they didn't distribute very many points on drug A option. They thought it was not drug A. But what happened when they received methamphetamine? When they received smaller doses, they thought it's more like placebo. The bit higher doses, they thought, probably it is methamphetamine-like. And highest doses, they correctly identified methamphetamine. This 10 milligram was a training dose, by the way, and this average response to 8 participants. The fun thing starts now. What happens when we gave them diamphetamine? They identified diamphetamine as methamphetamine. They thought when they received diamphetamine, it's a drug A-like effect. Same thing happened with methylphenidate. When they received methylphenidate, they thought it's a drug A. If you see the dose response curves, the slopes and intercepts very much aligned. We did a family of curve analysis, and this dose response curves just like on top of each other. And if you notice, these 2 highest doses completely substituted for methamphetamine. The triazolone is pharmacologically distinct drug, and sure enough, it didn't produce methamphetamine-like responding in drug discrimination paradigm, and that really confirmed our hypothesis that this is a pharmacological negative control and provide more robustness to our paradigm and results. Now this and next series of slides I'm going to show subjective effects of these drugs. And on left, this is adjective rating scale, the stimulant subscale which I mentioned a minute ago. And on right is benzodrine group, subscale of Addiction Research Center inventory. These both scales kind of captured the stimulant-like effect of drugs. And if you see methamphetamine, diamphetamine, and methylphenidate, those dependently increase the scores on stimulant scale and benzodrine group scale of ARCI, telling that these drugs did produce stimulant-like effects. Triazolone had very little effect. When asked questions, do you like this drug? Do you feel good effects? And they said, yeah. They dose dependently said yes. The participants responded in a very linear manner when dose was increased, and triazolone had very little of such effect. Participants also rated themselves being stimulated and talkative friendly just after the smallest doses of methamphetamine, diamphetamine, and methylphenidate, and triazolone had a very little or none of such effect. So does it mean that we didn't see much effect of triazolone? So does it mean that this drug was devoid of any effect? We use a range of doses which were behaviorally inactive? So that's not the case. If you look at the left panel is a sedative scale of adjective rating scale, which captures sedative, drowsy, more downward kind of effect, and triazolone did show across doses high response on this scale, and if anything we saw some decrease in response to methamphetamine, diamphetamine, and methylphenidate. And participants also rated themselves being sluggish, fatigued, and lazy after a range of doses of triazolone, and not after receiving methamphetamine, diamphetamine, and methylphenidate. So this really serves a very strong non-pharmacological control that triazolone didn't share discriminative stimulus effects. It didn't share subjective effects, but it did have a very strong sedative-like effect, and we captured that. This slide is busy. Let me walk you through. The purpose is this slide is to show that how these effects vary over time. So the first column is methamphetamine. second column is D-amphetamine, third column is methylphenidate, and fourth is triazolone. And each row indicates a different behavioral measure. Let me walk you through with the first slide. On the abscissa, you'll see pre 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, indicating pre was the measure that we obtained before we gave drug, and then every hour after, how the effects changed over time. If you notice, this particular row shows data from the MBG subscale of Addiction Research Center inventory. It captures euphoric-like effects. And if you see methamphetamine, D-amphetamine, and methylphenidate, across doses and time, show very similar response to euphoria-like effect. When they were asked, do you feel active, alert, and energetic, these three drugs produce very similar response across time. And so was the case when they were asked, are you willing to take this drug again? They say yes, more time, and the effects went down. So these slides tell us that not only behavioral effects, but also the way drug metabolizes in our system, pharmacokinetic effects are very similar too across these two drugs. Triazolone had very little of these effects, as you see in the last column. We also wanted to show that these drugs are safe, otherwise FDA wouldn't allow us to continue the study. So we included heart rate and blood pressure. And methamphetamine, D-amphetamine, and methylphenidate did increase heart rate and blood pressure to some extent. And there was some statistical significance here for methamphetamine, but luckily it didn't go off the chart, and it was clinically significant. They were not clinically significant responses. So, and none of our subjects experienced any serious side effects. So that was good. So we could safely administer these drugs to humans without any significant major side effects, while capturing the relative abuse-related effects. So let me summarize the findings. In our study, methamphetamine did function as a discriminative stimulus and produced prototypical stimulant-like subjective effects, and methylphenidate and D-amphetamine fully substituted for methamphetamine and produced behavioral and pharmacological effects that were very similar to that of methamphetamine. So what does it tell us about relative abuse liability? Well, first of all, this was the very first study in humans that used drug discrimination paradigm to assess abuse potential of prescription stimulants relative to that of methamphetamine. But this also tells us that to the extent that behavioral and pharmacological effects really contribute to the abuse potential of these medications, the similarity in behavioral effects of these drugs with methamphetamine tell us about the strong abuse potential of D-amphetamine and methylphenidate. It also gives us an indication that being similar behavioral profile and pharmacological profile of these drugs, it could serve as agonist substitution therapy for methamphetamine dependence. We don't have an FDA-approved treatment for methamphetamine dependence, and similarity in neurochemical behavioral profile of Adderall and Ritalin kind of poses a good question on conducting a few studies on examining can they serve as agonist substitution therapies. Like we have nicotine for smoking, we have methadone for heroin and opioid addiction. Okay, so now we're going to shift gear and talk about other two studies. Drug discrimination studies and subjective effect questionnaires are useful, but they don't tell us much about drug taking, actual drug taking that happens on streets. What we can do in the human laboratory? Well, there are several different measures to assess this reinforcing or rewarding effects of drugs and examining drug taking in the laboratory. Free access procedures are one, where participants, particularly they're used for alcohol or smoking or caffeine studies, and participants are given free access to drink or smoke, and we carefully examine how many drinks or how many puffs they have taken and how many caffeinated beverages they have taken, and we can systematically change this across session by giving naltrexone in some session and seeing how it reduces free access to alcohol, how varenicline modulates free access to smoking, and so forth. But our focus was on stimulants, so we use a different procedure. Let me talk to you briefly about choice procedures. They are useful procedures too. In this kind of paradigms, people sample drug and then make series of choices between drug and placebo, or drug and a range of different amounts of money. And if they choose drug more often than other option, that tells us about the rewarding effect of drugs and gives us an estimate of drug taking in the laboratory. But more relevant to our studies, we use operant paradigms, schedule control measures, which are to us a more robust way to examine the drug taking in the laboratory. In this design, drug delivery is contingent upon producing certain kind of responses. It could be anything in animals, animal studies, animals placed in operant chamber, and levers come out, and rats or monkeys or even pigeons, they press the lever to obtain drug as reinforcer. They are cannulated in the jugular vein, so they receive drug directly in vein. So that's how these operant paradigms work. In the next two studies, we'll examine utility of progressive ratio measures in assessing reinforcing effects of stimulants and methamphetamine. So these are two studies, and I'm going to talk about these two studies together. The first study examined reinforcing effects of D-amphetamine using progressive ratio schedule, and second study used progressive ratio to study intravenous methamphetamine. And there were some procedural differences between these two studies, but it provided a useful comparison to some extent to see on side by side how reinforcing effects of these two drugs, the amphetamine and methamphetamine, changed under this schedule. So let me talk to you about progressive ratio measure. These procedures are widely used in preclinical studies, and they measure reward or reinforcing strength of drugs. In this procedure, response requirements, also called ratio, they progressively increase for obtaining each successive reinforcer until the participant stops responding. And final ratio completed by participant is termed as breakpoint. And by the way, response requirements could be anything. Animal pressing levers is the response requirement. Humans, the range of different operands are studied in humans. We typically studied a computer mouse press and key press, but there are many mouse presses that needed to obtain one drug. So I'll talk more about that in a particular method design. And lots of drugs of abuse, opioids, benzodiazepines, caffeine, they dose-dependently increase breakpoints of progressive ratio schedules in animals and humans. But very little is known about utility of this measure in assessing stimulants. Some work has been done before, but the relative reinforcing efficacy of D-amphetamine and methamphetamine is not fully understood. So here are the general procedures. In our first study, 2A, 8 participants completed this study, and they were non-medical users of prescription stimulants. And second study, where we recruited methamphetamine abusers, they were receiving IV methamphetamine. And here's the design. Study 2A and Study 2B, they were 10 sessions long, and first 2 sessions were practice sampling and practice self-administration sessions. They were designed to make participants familiar with the behavioral routine, laboratory procedures, and so forth. Also allowed us to understand the medical safety of at least a medium dose of D-amphetamine. So if somebody is very sensitive to this effect, we can capture early on without giving them too much of drug down the road. And that made us a little bit easier to go through IRB in this kind of studies, and FDA like that too, particularly when we ask them that we're going to give IV methamphetamine to people.
I've been wondering about that, how that IRB went.
It was extensive. It took us about 1.5 years to go through IRB and FDA, and we had to write my own investigation new drug application because this was a completely different route than desoxyzine is approved for pharmaceutical marketing. So yeah, we write our own IND, and I still have it active on my name. The next 8 sessions were divided into 4 pairs, and each pair had a sampling session and a self-administration session. And let's take a pair here. For example, session 9 and 10 had sampling and self-administration sessions, and they received 24 milligram of D-amphetamine or methamphetamine on those days. So on sampling sessions in the morning, they received this drug, the oral D-amphetamine capsules. They were given in 8 different capsules for methamphetamine, given in different number of IV infusions, IV injections. And after receiving this drug, we asked them to pay a very close attention to how this drug made them feel, write their own individual notes, how this drug made them feel. We asked them range of subjective questionnaires which they completed, and I'll show you the data from their responses. But on the reason why we asked them to pay close attention and write notes, because on next day, self-administration session, they could refer to these notes and decide if they want to work or how much they want to work on progressive ratio task to obtain or to earn the drug they sampled yesterday. So if a participant wanted to work on the task, they were required to click computer mouse a predetermined number of times. For example, out of 8 capsules they sample on sampling session, to obtain the very first capsule, which is 1/8 of the sample dose, subjects had to click mouse 400 times. And the number of clicks required to earn each additional capsule increased by 200, and the total requirement to obtain the entire dose was 8,800 mouse clicks. It isn't fun for people who doesn't have enough motivation to get this drug. Dependent measures the number of capsules for D-amphetamine or injections for methamphetamine that were earned in this progressive ratio task, and the subjective drug effect questionnaires, which I mentioned before, and cardiovascular measures such as heart rate and blood pressure. So let me show you results. Here on the left panel, I'm showing data from study 2A. On the right panel, which will come pretty soon, the data from study 2B. And this graph shows that ordinate shows number of capsules earned. So when they sampled placebo, they didn't want to work too much to obtain placebo again. But when they did receive D-amphetamine, they work to a decent amount to obtain D-amphetamine. It tells us that D-amphetamine has some reinforcing effects. And so was the case for IV methamphetamine. This study is under review in Journal of Clinical Psychopharmacology, but if you see, the response is not too different. They didn't work hard to obtain placebo injections, but they performed very much on progressive ratio tasks to obtain IV methamphetamine injections, indicating that these two drugs do serve as reinforcer, and they have some good reward-related effects, reinforcing effects. This next several slides show subjective responses of participants to different doses of D-amphetamine and methamphetamine. And when they receive placebo, here was the response, and participants receive different doses of D-amphetamine and methamphetamine. They dose-dependently increase the response on stimulant scale of adjective rating scale. And as I mentioned before, this scale kind of captures the stimulant-like effect of drugs, and it is apparent that these two drugs produce very similar effect, like we have seen in previous study.
Hey Raj, can you go back to that slide right there?
Yeah.
So on the left, why the peak at 16 and then the drop at 24? Is that saying that people were not as motivated to get 24 milligrams of D-amphetamine? That's what it says. It basically says it peaked at 16.
Right. That's a great question. That's a very good question. What we had seen so far in the literature and some of the previous studies from our lab, Dr. Rush's lab, was that we typically obtain this inverted U-shaped dose response curve. It's very difficult to obtain in human studies. In animal studies, you increase dose high enough so the dose response curve goes down and obtain inverted U-shaped doses. But in human studies, it's not common. But then that tells us about a lot of different variables that can influence. One important thing to look at is behavioral demand. Here, they had to press 8,800 times to obtain all the capsules, and if that drug was not, that particular dose produced more adverse effects, then that interest probably went down. But then that also tells us that what about at least we control and change the variable that we can, like behavioral demands. What about we change the response requirements? And we did change it here. And when we reduce behavioral demand, not 8,800 total times of mouse clicking, here it was close to 4,000 or so, and we saw a little bit uplift in those response curves. Part of the reason was this was from my R21 grant from UCLA, and one important aspect I mentioned by showing several of these studies, sorry for this, was that there was very little separation in my previous study and several studies reported in the literature between placebo and drug. And does it tell me that they don't have reinforcing efficacy? No, in animal studies and on the street, people use this drug consistently. It's just about sensitivity of laboratory paradigm to identify the magnitude of reinforcing effects. And then I changed the design parameters in progressive ratio schedule to an extent that we could capture that. So before coming here, I completed a study in UCLA, and I increased the minimal response requirements to reduce placebo responding. and reduce the maximal response requirements to increase drug responding, and thereby separate the effects of placebo and drug. And this is important because now this procedure is more sensitive for pharmacological manipulation. So for example, a lot of people use some standard laboratory paradigm and say, oh, we are examining new drug, naltrexone probably could be useful for amphetamine dependence too. Oh, it didn't change the reinforcing effects. Well, the drug didn't produce reinforcing effects to begin with. Our paradigm was not sensitive enough. How much down a pharmacological agent would push the dose response curve? That was the rationale why, in my R20, when I kind of proposed to change the requirement, made this procedure more sensitive, so that it is more amenable to pharmacological modification. And now you can shift the dose response curve with the future pharmacotherapy.
So this is the behavior, and then the next ones are subjective,
right?
And then that's why they're all increasing.
Right, right, that's right.
Got it.
Yeah. So these are subjective responses I mentioned about stimulant effects of these two drugs, very similar. When we ask question, do you feel any effect after taking this drug? And they say, yes, we do, and they dose dependently increase the responding. Similar was the case for the active, alert, and energetic question. Very similar response to active, alert, and energetic question with both drugs. And they felt good effects after taking D-amphetamine and methamphetamine, produced almost similar response. So let me summarize the findings. In the progressive ratio task, D-amphetamine and methamphetamine both served as reinforcers. They produce reward-related effects and function as reinforcer in this task. And both these drugs increase dose-dependently subjective responses, very similarly almost, to a lot of different scales and questionnaires we had. So reinforcing and subjective effects of D-amphetamine and methamphetamine appear isomorphic. And because reinforcing effects are considered very central to the abuse of stimulants, these drugs tell us about how a person is willing to take this drug again. That's the premise of assessing reinforcing effects. Being very similar, that tells us that the amphetamine also has an abuse potential as high as that of methamphetamine, and confirms our previous finding in a different behavioral measure. So let me summarize findings I have shown you so far. So far, I hope I convince you that D-amphetamine, methylphenidate, and methamphetamine share discriminative stimulus, subjective, and reinforcing effects in humans. And to the extent that these behavioral effects dictate abuse of prescription stimulants, we can say that D-amphetamine and methylphenidate inherently carry abuse potential as high as that of methamphetamine. So where do we go from here next? We had some curious questions. We thought that are some people more prone than others to prescription stimulant abuse? If so, how do we identify them to target prevention efforts? What are those personality traits and characteristics that tell these people apart, and we can say these people are more prone to abuse of non-medical stimulants? And that is our next study. We showed that certain personality traits such as inattention and hyperactivity made them more susceptible to stimulant abuse. So that was published a few years ago. And indeed, there are certain characteristics of people that make them more susceptible to non-medical use of stimulants that are prescribed, and several studies in literature have shown they have identified some characteristics of people who are more prone, more susceptible to develop abuse stimulants. They tend to be college students, they tend to be male, they tend to have lower GPA, they tend to have affiliations in Greek organizations like a fraternity and sorority on campus, and they also tend to have attentional problems. Indeed, several studies have shown that self-reported ADHD symptoms, they are not fully diagnosed individuals as ADHD, or not full-blown clinical scenario of having ADHD, but just subclinical level of self-reported ADHD symptoms, or the responses on standardized questionnaires that captures inattention and hyperactivity. They tend to have persistent non-medical use of stimulants. So we examined this relationship between personality trait, inattention, hyperactivity, and abuse-related behavioral effects of D-amphetamine. And here are the methods. This was a more retrospective analysis. There were 6 studies conducted in the lab, and total 27 participants were enrolled. And based on their responses on this 13-item inattention and hyperactivity scale, we grouped them. So we classified them in the high score group, in the low score group. So participants who responded more than 75 percentile were grouped in high score, and who responded 25 percentile or less, they were classified into low score group. The test drug was oral D-amphetamine and placebo. Dependent measures are subjective questionnaires, cardiovascular measures, and session timeline was similar, what I have shown before. So here are the results. The circles are circles are participants in the high score group, squares are low score group. If you see across the range of doses of D-amphetamine, participants in the high score group produce greater amount of behavioral effects than low score group. They were more sensitive to agitative stimulant-like effects of D-amphetamine. And when asked questions, do you feel active, alert, and energetic, they responded significantly higher than participants in the low score group. They are more sensitive to D-amphetamine's effects. So was the case, the participants in the high score group reported themselves being talkative and friendly, and they liked drug more than participants in the low score group did. And one more time, participants in high score group reported themselves being stimulated or their performance improved to a greater extent than participants in the low score group. But these effects were specific. They were very selective effects. If you see the actual autonomic data, cardiovascular responses to this drug, they were reversed. The participants in the high score group were less sensitive to cardiovascular enhancing effects of D-amphetamine. And there was systolic pressure and diastolic pressure. So subjective effects of D-amphetamine were significantly enhanced in participants who scored very high on this inattention and hyperactivity scale. And the symptoms, independent of actual ADHD diagnosis, looks like make people more sensitive to the abuse-related behavioral effects of stimulants. And to the extent the subjective effects of D-amphetamine really dictate its abuse, participants responding more to subjective effects appear to be more prone to abusing D-amphetamine. And these results are very consistent with previous studies shown. I think Fran Levin in Colombia has done some good work. Scott Collins has done very good work in this area too. So these results, along with the epidemiological findings, have very important bearings on early diagnosis, screening, symptom management, and prevention effort targeted towards individuals with personality traits of inattention and hyperactivity. So here the overall summary for all these 4 studies I have shown so far. The findings from this study indicate that prescription stimulants such as D-amphetamine and methylphenidate, which are Adderall, Ritalin, Metadate, they carry abuse potential at par with that of methamphetamine. And people with inattention and hyperactivity personality traits may be susceptible to the stimulant abuse. And I would like to acknowledge my colleagues, collaborators, and mentors who helped me conduct these studies. Edie London at UCLA, her P20 grant was very instrumental. Craig Rush, University of Kentucky, is an amazing mentor, and his Civil R1 grant supported the conduct of study. Bill Stoke was a great collaborator, and 2 of my R21 grants also helped conduct all the studies too. So now then, after finishing these studies, I transitioned to ETSU. And I'm so excited to be part of a research group here with Dr. Pack, Dr. Hagemeyer. We are very excited to conduct and extend these studies into naturalistic setting in non-medical use of prescription stimulants and prescription drugs as such. And more, actually earlier this week we submitted this grant to Tennessee Board of Regents to examine non-medical use of prescription stimulants on college campuses, particularly community colleges in Tennessee, because TBR kind of oversees the 13 community colleges with the Tennessee Promise and Teen Achieves programs in effect, would be very timely and relevant to examine non-medical use on these community college campuses, the extent, severity, and negative consequences of these drugs. And we propose to model them in the context of theory of planned behavior. And I feel also lucky that Dr. Pack included me as a co-investigator in his large U1 grant.
Are you kidding? We were lucky to have you here. Your expertise helped make that proposal, I think, pretty strong. So we're gonna see in the next month or so how whether or not it was score well.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I feel blessed to have senior collaborators and mentors like you and Dr. Hagemeyer. Appreciate it. So those are studies that we plan to conduct and grant proposals are in, but we did have the survey instrument in the making. So Nick and I, we put together this 44-item questionnaire to assess prescription stimulant abuse on campus. And in the last semester, Dr. Linton's class, we had a chance to actually see a initial field taste of that instrument in a small sample of students, community sample. And let me show you initial results from that finding as well. So that is a small sample. We just wanted to see feasibility of conducting that larger survey. It's just about 29 students, and this was a 44-item survey. And let me show you demographic characteristics. Out of 29 students, 8 of them were ever users. They ever used non-medical stimulants, the stimulants in a non-medical manner. And the 21 never did it. So we divided into never users and ever users. And we did this study, Ron and I did it together in Dr. Linton's class. The demographic variable didn't change too much. It was gender, race, age, or GPA, but there are several other things that did change, and I'll show you. For example, the ever users, the number of percentage of ever users was significantly higher in students who tried 2 or more illicit drugs. There were more number of students in ever group who tried 2 or more illicit drugs and never users. These ever users also had friends, very close friends, who tended to use prescription drugs in non-medical manner. And they also tended to be members of Greek organization. And very interestingly, during their stay on ETSU, they tended to have the psychiatric condition, major depressive disorder. Yes.
I wanted to say, the first graph there brings up an issue that I wondered about the other study that you did.
Yeah.
I wondered how thorough you evaluated the personality traits and the psychiatric condition of those subjects that were
Were recruited.
the attention deficit disorder. Because, there may be impulsivity issue. This implies that there's impulsivity may be playing a role here,
right,
in their drug selection and how much they may get high from it.
That's right.
And that may correlate with ADHD, and it might be lost in there.
That's a very good question. Very, very, very important question. So his question is, in your previous studies, did we screen participants in terms of having a diagnosis of ADHD or even subclinical levels of ADD, kind of inattention and hyperactivity symptomatology, which could have contributed to their behavior responses where even we didn't divide them into high score and low score group? That's a very valid question. What we did, we had very thorough inclusion and exclusion criteria, a very long list of them, and we had the psychologist in our team. She conducted case stats. It's in personal psychology-based personal interview with the participant and identify all DSM-4 based symptoms of inattention and hyperactivity, and anybody who scored higher than the threshold, even on those questionnaire and clinical diagnosis, she excluded them. So we made sure to screen participants in that context, particularly seeing their sensitivity to prescription stimulants.
But not in this sample. This is just a little pilot.
This is a pilot one, right? Not here, right? In our previous human laboratory studies.
But I was referring to the study where you showed that the ADHD people seem to get higher.
Right.
Were those screened for other behavioral traits that might have correlated with ADHD, like impulsivity and that? Or were they just,
yes,
they were ADHD?
That's a good question. So in that particular study, when we did divide them high score and low score group, it was based on this scale, inattention and hyperactivity rating scale. But they also completed a lot of other questionnaires. We did screen them for sensation seeking. And they tended to have a little bit higher response on sensation seeking. We just didn't achieve statistical significance.
Okay.
and some other questionnaires there were too, and we try to compare and make him as clean as possible, and they tended to have a little bit more. For example, this participant showed a history of a little bit more marijuana abusers high score than the lower score, with more drinks per week than, but the number was not large enough to capture statistical significance. Yeah, but the number in inattention score was very high, it was very easily separable. So these are the data, and even in a small sample of few 29 undergraduate students in ETSU, that gives us a story that is consistent with what we have seen in literature at the national level. A lot of other universities have shown similar findings, that people having the membership in Greek organizations, having the close friends and peers abusing drugs, and having psychiatric conditions, they tend to non-medically use stimulants and other drugs more often. So even in a small sample, we are glad to capture that effect. And this slide shows reason for non-medically using stimulants. Majority of them say they use it for focusing in the study, to lose weight, to get high, for fun and party, athletic performance, for several different reasons. And they did experience adverse effects from non-medical use. They lost appetite, they had insomnia, heart rate, some of them reported headaches. So they had range of adverse effects. So as part of, we conducted a focus group in this population, and we selected a few students from campus to participate in this focus group. There weren't very many, but the purpose for this focus group was to gather students' perceptions, views, opinions about what they see around them on ETSU campus. Do they see a lot of drug misuse, abuse? They see a lot of people using outside of the way it was prescribed. And after carefully going through this focus group, one important thing that came out of this was misconception of harm. The students, they thought that non-medical use of prescription stimulants is really non-harmful. They didn't have full understanding of these drugs and their pharmacology, and probably a lot of other negative consequences that can cause. To an extent, these drugs can cause cardiac arrest and lots of cardiovascular and psychiatric issues, but they weren't fully aware of the negative consequences after chronic use. So despite they face a lot of adverse effects, they didn't have full understanding of the harm. So another important theme that came out was social norm. It's all right to use this drug. Everybody's using it. It's not that bad to use them. Many interviews opined that it's common for ETSU undergraduate students to use prescription stimulants, and it's not difficult to obtain. They have apps, very anonymous way to obtain these drugs. They have social networks to get access to these drugs, and this relative ease of access and the view of commonality led to consider non-medical use as a social norm on our campus. So there are several priority issues and recommendations here. First of all, non-medical users tend to be more likely to report illicit drug use. They have higher rates of psychiatric conditions, more likely to be members of Greek organization and experience several adverse effects, despite they have misconception of harm. And a few things we could do is greater involvement of counseling center for addressing NMUS, the illicit drug use. We better disseminate information about availability of mental health support group on campus, organize awareness campaigns to enhance their understanding of what range of side effect profile these drugs have, and we cultivate coping strategies during exam tests, particularly where we see a peak in this kind of drug use, and kind of construct stress reliever programs. So we are spearheading this research on non-medical use of stimulants within the umbrella of prescription drug abuse on our campus, and we are very excited about this opportunity, and I'm very glad to be here and among all of us here. Thank you. I would like to acknowledge great help of my mentor, Nick Hagemeyer. He's been amazing help and helped me nurture, grow in this environment, and accepted me as part of family. Appreciate it, Nick. And so is Dr. Pack. He's wonderful senior co-instigator on several of our studies and provides great parent-like feeling to us being part of family. Thank you so much. Mary Littleton helped with the study that we conducted last in initial small sample. Ron Karikov was my partner in crime in conducting this study. Thank you, Ron. And Angie Hageman is amazing, the way she manages a lot of things, and the DIDUP team. Thank you so much, everybody. College of Pharmacy and College of Public Health. Appreciate it. Thanks for your time and attention to my talk. Appreciate it.